What's going on, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. We're going to be reading more of Dreamland today by Sam Quinones. This is page 181. The chapter's called Tar Pit. Panorama City, California. "You're cheating on me, you bastard," a woman yelled into the phone at her husband in Mexico. Marina Lopez was mad. Here she was in that rundown apartment, packaging dope all day. Her husband, Oscar Hernandez Garcia, was philandering down in their hometown of Jalisco, and now Marina was hearing the gossip all the way up in Panorama City. The argument escalated. "That's it, woman," Hernandez Garcia yelled into the phone. "I'm not coming back. I'm staying down here." Unbeknownst to the couple, narcotics agents were listening in. The marital spat sent jolts across the country to the highest levels of American law enforcement. It was June 12, 2000. By now, the case dubbed Operation Tar Pit reached across more of the United States than any other drug investigation in the history of the country. The bust was set to take place 3 days hence. At the top of the indictment, the lead defendant, the guy around whom the case was built, was Oscar Hernandez Garcia, wholesaling heroin across the country from his Panorama City apartment. The June 15th bust date had been set weeks before by officials at the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, who had the job of coordinating dozens of law enforcement agencies in cities across the country. But it almost required the presence of the United States of Oscar Hernandez Garcia, and now it appeared that a marital tiff was going to keep him in Mexico. Given icy relations between the two countries regarding criminal extraditions, he might forever be out of reach of U.S. justice. Lisa Feldman, the federal prosecutor in charge of the case in Los Angeles, got on the phone to officials in Washington. "We can't change the date," she was told. "But he's my lead defendant." "We've got too many resources committed. Sorry, it's got to happen then." For the next 3 days, Feldman and the agents waited on edge to see whether Oscar and Marina would make up. They did. Oscar Hernandez Garcia got on a plane to Los Angeles. Hours later, a SWAT team hit their apartment. They found dope in the dishwasher and money in a container of baby formula. At the same time, federal agents and local cops swarmed into apartments in Cleveland and Columbus, in Salt Lake City and Phoenix, and Maui, Hawaii. In Portland that morning, 108 officers met at a cavernous conference room at a North Portland motel to discuss how they would hit 18 residences and another 15 cars. Rock Stone stayed up most of the night listening to Jalisco Boy's wiretaps, fearing he would miss something. By then, he had tracked these Nahirites to 27 cities in 22 states, a massive yet diffuse corporation of drugs designed to resemble a motley collection of street dealers, and unlike any narcotics network he had ever known. At 6 a.m. in southwest Albuquerque, Jim Kuykendall and other agents burst into a 2-story adobe-style house where Enrique then lived with his girlfriend and her children. They arrested another half-dozen of his drivers. Later, Kuykendall sat down to talk with Enrique. He just portrayed himself as a poor guy from small-town Mexico trying to make a buck, and if there was nothing too wrong about what he was doing. Kuykendall remembered. "A family guy looking out for his family and kids. I talked to too many of the girls he'd slept with to believe that. He was a farm boy and a mid-level trafficker." Enrique spent the next 13 years in a U.S. federal prison. Across the country that day, 182 people were arrested in a dozen cities in Operation Tar Pit. Agents seized relatively small quantities of drugs and cash, 60 pounds of heroin and $200,000. Yet Tar Pit remains the largest case, geographically and in terms of manpower used, that the DEA and FBI have ever mounted jointly. This is the first time we've seen a criminal drug trafficking organization go coast to coast, also hitting Alaska and Hawaii, DEA Administrator Donnie R. Marshall said at the press conference. The bust reflected the spread of Mexican immigration. Mexican immigrants were now coast to coast too. They formed the working classes in North Carolina, Alaska, Idaho, Minnesota, and Nevada. Mexicans were the largest influx of foreign-born labor to the American South since slavery. They were in the biggest cities and were revitalizing parts of heartland America. The only locally owned new businesses in many rural towns were those that Mexicans started, and it was common by 2000 to find Mexican restaurants in Mississippi or an out-of-the-way burg in Tennessee. This also meant Mexican traffickers had more places to blend in. That wasn't true even 5 years before. But by the late 90s, as Mexican immigration was now virtually nationwide, Mexican drug networks, national in scope, were now possible too. Such a thing was unprecedented in the history of U.S. organized crime. Not even the Italian mafia had done it, but Operation Tar Pit showed that the Jalisco boys had. They were a new kind of drug trafficking in America. The Jalisco boys weren't the General Motors of drugs. They succeeded because they were the internet of dope. A network of cells with no one in charge of them all, with drivers rotating in and out, complementing each other as they competed for every junkie's last $20, yet doing this without guns, shutting down their phones fast as a website at any hint of law enforcement's approach. Back in Jalisco that August, the Feria del Elote was dead. Bandas came to town and left empty-handed. Most cell owners left for Guadalajara, believing they were on some DEA or FBI list. The man went on the lam and returned to Jalisco just before the feria. The town dried up, he said. Nobody was coming to the plaza. He was arrested in South Carolina 2 years later and sent to prison. The case against him was based mostly on wiretaps of his conversations with Hernandez Garcia and with FedEx tracking the whereabouts of the packages of ovens stuffed with black tar heroin. In Portland, Rock Stone would put together 2 more operations against the Jalisco boys, targeting a video store and a bridal shop that funneled crew money home to Nayarit and sold the Jalisco networks their indispensable cell phones and pagers. He found an apartment that had 155 cars registered to it and shut that down too. Along the way, though, he came to a sobering conclusion. It wasn't just that the Jalisco runners were endlessly replaced. It was that even if Stone kept attacking management levels of these Nayarit heroin crews, the managers, too, would be replaced quickly. He'd never seen this in narcotics. Informants told him that Tejeda Sanchez clan alone, with the Lermas, Diaz's, Bernals, Cienfuegoses, Hernandez's, Garcias, and the rest, were more than 200 deep back in Nayarit, and any of them could rotate into a heroin crew in Portland as a regional sales manager or a cell supervisor. Not only that, though, on the horizon hovered a specter even more disturbing than rotating squads of heroin franchise upper management, bizarre as the idea might seem. As Tar Pit took place, out of the east was swelling a wave of opiate abuse, creating vast numbers of new addicts as it swept west across America. All right, that's the end of part 1. We're going to start part 2. That's on page 187. And part 2 is just a little bit shorter than part 1. And as long as I'm not getting sick as often this winter, I'll be reading more often to you guys. So that'll probably take a little less time than the first half of the book. Hope you're enjoying it. I am. Keep fighting that good fight.